And the reason why I'm talking about memory is because when you think of what the classical age was about and Homer, and that it was, in a way, we saved the memories of our ancient cultures through poetic means or orators who came on a platform to tell you a story, which kept reminding us and not forgetting. Unlike today, everything, there's just so much going on that people don't even know what happened 5 years. They don't even know what movie they saw yesterday. And to imagine, to think that during that illiterate age, when this was, Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey between the 8th and 9th century of a period that took place in the 13th century BC. How do you recall that? And then it became, the beating heart of Western culture. And when you look at what he created all those years ago to what we have today in filmmaking, in series, in mini-series, how do we, novellas, how we tell stories. This is the birth of that, these stories. And also, it was the respect of those who passed and the way we kept their memories alive.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to ArtiFact number 62. I'm excited today to bring you Thaao Penghlis. He is an actor. He's, in fact, a legendary actor that appeared in Days of Our Lives. He appeared in the Mission Impossible TV show from the 80s. And one thing that I did not know about him prior to getting a solicitation to do the show is he actually has a ton of internal depth that I respect quite a bit. People that view this channel know that I love culture, I love the arts, I love to read. And recently, Thaao, he put together a podcast on, let's just call it the archaeology of the Trojan War of Homer. There's always been a controversy going back a long time whether or not the Homeric tales are based on some sort of historical reality or whether this was just sort of added after the fact. And he did a podcast. It's a mini series of 4 episodes thus far. Called Thao's Treasures, and it covers. It begins with the archaeologist, the amateur archaeologist from the 1800s, named Heinrich Schliemann, who is very controversial today, but he was very much, in some ways, kind of the first to do some of the things that he did. And we're going to go through some of the controversies and the podcast in general. But we will also be talking about Homer and the Iliad in general. As some of you guys might know, in college, I was a classics major. So I love the classics, right? The Aeneid is probably one of my favorite tales. As you can see, it's just full of my notes going back a very long time. This is a translation actually by Rolf Humphreys, mostly unknown now, but I do think it's one of the best out there. So without further ado, is there anything that you would like to add by way of introduction?
You're talking to me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I saw you looking down the whole time. So I was like, all right, does he know that I'm speaking? But yeah.
Yes, I'm listening. Sometimes I just put my head down and just listen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because, let's face it, listening is what gives you the ammunition to tell a story. I mean, if we don't listen, we don't know. And, I started as a kid. I remember at 8 years of age, I was running up the stairs. My father was playing cards, and they're all bragging about, these Greeks were bragging about their sons. And then they said, "Oh, what's your son going to do when he grows up?" And my father called me as I was running up the stairs, and I said, "An archaeologist." So in many ways, I kind of identified with Schliemann. That's a wonderful thing about life. You never know where you're going to end up. And but other than the work as an actor, I had other interests, and that's why I've traveled to Egypt so often, and to the Middle East, and to Greece and Italy, because I liked to explore cultures that didn't steal or borrow from others. Who were their own individual cultures that in the 18th and 19th century, the French, the Germans, the English, they stole so much of other cultures and filled their museums with it. And so I loved because I wanted to explore Greek culture on my own rather than what I was taught growing up in Australia. I had to learn to speak Greek because my mother couldn't speak English. So we would go to Greek school afterwards. And so slowly when I came to America is when I started to discover what I liked about Greece, because it's what I began to miss, that which I ran away. But I was loving it in my own terms. So education for me, I'm a very self-educated kind of guy. I studied what I wanted, not what someone else told me. I didn't want to study somebody else's ideas. I wanted to find them out for myself. And I think that's what archaeology is about. You know, it's finding the truth of what took place a long time ago and why we're still interested, because in many ways, it is what was the phrase somebody used? It was the unspoken word, in a sense that we were trying to unravel the truth behind what took place in the 13th century, around 1250 BC, what happened between the Greeks and the Trojans, and through Homer's storytelling, oration was the core of how people would tell stories. And even today, when I went to Syria and when I went to Turkey, on the way to Troy, I stopped at some cafes and there were men there with guitars or an ancient instrument telling a tale of what took place. So the oratory experience is still going on today. And because it was an illiterate age, nobody was writing these stories down. So how did they remember them? And when you think about Homer's work, it became the core of what you see today in movies, what you see as miniseries, what you see as novellas, what you see in an ongoing series, when you see film and the way we tell stories. This was the heart of ancient culture, of the Greek culture that was given to the West. And also, the East had their own versions of things, but what we got from that was that someone had the respect of the past. They wanted for us to remember what took place before we came onto the earth. And so I thought it was so important, when you go to school, how does somebody tell a story? Well, we can't even remember what happened 5 years ago. So when you think of somebody who remembered of a tale, and I'm quite sure it was their interpretation of the Trojan War, or what happened when Schliemann discovered that the Iliad was a map to finding Troy, that this is how he began, this was his idea. And so in 1824, at the age of 8, he swore that he would find Troy, and because he thought there was treasures. That was the boy's imagination going on. And so for me, it was the same thing. I don't know if you've ever dug in an ancient world and found treasures. I have. And to touch something that's never been touched because it's been hidden for so many centuries, that was, for me, an extraordinary thing. Emotionally, it was.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that about wanting to be an archaeologist when you were very young. For whatever reason, I also had those thoughts. I remember consciously having those thoughts when I was an adolescent. That ultimately didn't quite happen, but for whatever reason, I was always drawn to very old things. Not exactly sure why, but maybe there's just kind of an aspect to the fact that with enough passage of time, it does tend to level what's important and what's unimportant. And whatever is unimportant, right, we don't really get to see it as much. Obviously, there's exceptions. There's all kinds of, lost treasures, right? There's all kinds of lost literature, and a lot of it, I'm sure, is great. But it's a very big difference from, for example, like if you look at like out of curiosity, sometimes I would Google something like, oh, I wonder who the Nobel Prize winner was in literature, right, in like 1908 or 1922, or what are the bestsellers in America in 1943, right, fiction, nonfiction. And when you look at some of these books, and a lot of them would be available public domain, you think, wow, like there's really nothing to this, right? It's just a function purely of its time. And even 5 decades or a century could pass, and that is enough to level that. And there's something to, right, Homer having this kind of longevity. And I guess I would start the question with why exactly would you even have this interest in archaeology and doing this specific thing of Trojan history, Greek history? Because to me, I think the answer is very obvious. It would be one of literary value. I would have no chance of doing this show if I didn't think there was substance and value in Homer, right? In the ancient classics, and because I think that they are, right, I think it's worth talking about. Were you initially drawn to these things specifically through the arts, or was there some kind of like, I don't know, romance in the ether when it comes to like old things, or how did you get drawn to it? Because from what I recall, one of your interviews, you did say that you only read the Iliad for the first time in your 20s. So, how did you come to this, and why do this specific kind of show? Do you agree with me that it's really the arts and the literature that really justifies the kind of attention that you would give it?
Well, when you think about it, a country that doesn't have a culture dies. You have to you build the country on its history and what came before and how others influenced that history. The reason the Iliad, I don't think reading it in my 20s or when I did again later on made much of a difference. And even the movie interpretations were very disappointing because they were lies. They decided, oh, Hollywood wouldn't like that, so we'll do it this way, or we'll put this as a romantic interest when that didn't happen. So for me, I think because in high school, I remember my teacher used to tell me to stand up and tell the story of Hannibal, for instance, or something to deal with some part of ancient Greece. And I would do it in such a way that the teacher thought I had cheated because I knew it so well. That I found that what interests me and what my journeys have been about in my life was the unknown. What I didn't know. I may have read something, but I wanted to find it out on my own terms. Just like when I went to Egypt and I went into a tomb that had never been discovered before. On that particular day when they opened the door, I was the first one to enter because I knew of a nobleman there. And to walk in through a door that's over 4,000 years old and be the first one and then find ancient treasure in the sand there was quite, to me, so exciting, the idea that I was the first to touch that and what was behind that. And then I got emotional with it. When you think about Homer, he's really what I would say the beating heart of Greek culture. It started during an illiterate age between the 8th and the 9th century. It wasn't written until they began to have writing in the 7th century, between the 6th and 7th century BC. So all those centuries passed before someone was able to write it. So was it reinterpreted? This is what I always think. How did Homer remember all this and that kind of a verse? And, the thing that Schliemann was so interested in reading this was that he believed that the myths of Greece, the myths of Homer, were really actual facts, that these people did exist. So what his purpose was to put flesh and bone on these great heroes, because in many ways, by making them real, it gave us something of the past that we could look up to, because as human beings, that we are mortal, we always need to have something immortal. That's why, like God, the Christ figure, Buddha, all man seems to want to, like why in the Greek Orthodox Church we have icons, because we like to see something beyond ourselves. And so when Homer, who wrote these incredible passages telling the story, it then influenced the way orators used to come out in cafes and tell the stories in men's clubs, basically, because in those days women weren't allowed. But, they would be sitting there listening to a man telling them an ancient story. Well, we go to the movies now and we watch a filmmaker offer his story or his interpretation of what took place in this particular period. So when you go to a museum, the reason why we get intrigued with things that are ancient is because it's unknown and it draws us in. And then when we start reading the little excerpt that's underneath it, it fascinates us, that which has come before. So, and in many ways, we gave respect. The Greeks, and that particular time in its culture, gave respect to death and the afterlife. And in a way, it was how those who were still alive were paying respects to those who had gone. So it's the same way in which we tell the story. It's the same way in where Achilles, when his lover Patroclus dies, and how he pays homage to him and how it wounds him, that kind of loss. And so from that time, it allows us how to look upon something that we loved and respected. So it does with when we tell stories. We tell it particularly out of what came before us, what was that we can attain to something greater than who we are.
And maybe we shouldn't get too off the beaten path here, but what do you have a view on oral versus written tradition in Homer? Because I mean, the more that you read about the kind of academic debate about all this, it's a lot more complicated than something that you might hear in high school. Right? I can imagine a high school teacher saying something like, "Oh, and Homer was illiterate, right? And this was just an oral tradition that was passed on, passed on, passed on." It is more complicated than that. I think the consensus now is that Homer was some figure, for instance, that put the Iliad together from a grouping of myths, right? That also were part of an oral tradition, and perhaps the specific themes and the way that they were presented. That is part of the oral tradition. But when it comes down to it, it is very careful writing, right? It is written, in the same way that Shakespeare wrote in iambic pentameter. Although I don't put too much stock in something like meter, roughly speaking, let's call it iambic pentameter. In Greece, it would be, and Rome for that matter, right, which is more based on vowel lengths. It would be dactylic hexameter. That's way. It seems way too careful to me to just purely memorize it, right? At a certain point, you do have to sit down and get all this stuff down to really perfect it, to really add flourishes to it in a way that really kind of like stick. Certain flourishes, I can imagine if it was all oral, for example, one interpreter versus another reciter, they wouldn't even necessarily have the wherewithal to understand the beauty or the importance of a certain kind of flourish. And it probably did take somebody like Homer to sit down and put it together. And we can't quite say exactly what that would have looked like in the past. But my suspicion has always been, being a poet myself, that it's nigh impossible that this thing was not a written document that is more or less, in the form that it was, let's say in the 7th century or so BCE.
Yeah. So what's your question?
Like, do you take any positions on a written versus oral tradition, or is that like not of interest to you?
Well, we go to the theater where really people give us soliloquies and give us monologues and expressions of one character to another, and we're watching it live. And then we go to the movies and we see it already completed. And what's the difference in the theater is, of course, that every night could be a different kind of performance depending on the audience. And whereas film, it will remain the same because that's the finished product. But I've done one-man shows, and what I enjoyed about it is how do you tell a story? How did Homer tell his story? Don't forget, he was also blind. And so how does he tell a story? And so it's about not having too many bridges. It's not about going off track when you're trying to have a particular, it's like, the ancient warrior who aims at his target and hits it. It's the same thing. It's telling the audience if somebody asks you a question, you answer that question, you don't meander into other things and it confuses. So it's the same thing when you're telling a story. You don't meander with the story. You give a point of view. And so when I would tell the stories, and I would do like 5 different stories, and it would take about an hour and a half. I think it's important. I think they're two different. Telling a story live and reading about it yourself, and then watching it on film is all different. They're all different interpretations. Because one day you may tell a story in a certain tone, another day it may vary by the way you feel or the audience that's facing you, which you're telling the story. It's like at my dinner parties, I will have people around the table and you tell them the stories. The only thing is, there's a tendency sometimes for some of your friends to interrupt. Something they didn't get, or the attention, there's too much attention on you. And so therefore they want to pull it in, but that's part of the argument. And so oratory, when you think about how they used to tell the stories and in cafes and keep repeating the stories, but then, we look at the Bibles, for instance, and there were many, many Bibles until they shrunk them to 4. And then there were things taken out and reinterpreted. So it's the same thing in storytelling. And when those orators, and they still do it today, so obviously it works because people love listening to stories, especially stories of ancient heroes, of people who are greater than what we could imagine. So I think that's why for a long time since Star Wars, we've had many movies, heroic movies, mythical. Where did they come from? They came from the ancient Greek culture. And I think with Homer, because he was blind, how was he able to talk about when he did the Odyssey and how he went to all these different places before he was able to reach home, the long journey home to Ithaca. And where was Ithaca? And so if I remember, he became blind in his late 20s. So at least he had a concept in his mind of what he saw. That's why he was able to relate to how these places existed and what Ithaca looked like. So I like listening to people who know how to, like Obama. I like the way Obama, as an orator, when he knows how to throw out a line and let it land and wait and have the security within himself to know how that line lands, and by paying respect to the people who are listening. So there are many ways. There are a lot of storytellers. You could say, like politicians now, they're orators. How do you like the way they tell? Some people just keep repeating themselves and you lose interest. So, and others are very direct and succinct, and their stories are short. So because the span, the audience today, their concentration span is very short. So how would they listen to a story that, like, can you imagine somebody sitting there for 2 hours listening to Homer like they used to, because there was no other things that were distracting them? There were fewer, like we have today, too many things to distract us. Nothing too deep. So while you and I are talking about that, and you're talking about depth, part of the reason I think I'm not doing days anymore was because the head writer said to me I was too deep. And at first I thought, what does he mean by that? And are you trying to tell me that all that I've collected in my life, you can't interpret? So that's, to me, but I took it upon myself and realized that door shut and I was going elsewhere. So, what interests me in all these years, I was interested in the illiterate age, the silent age, where man had to reinterpret through what they found in the earth. So, there are many ways to tell a story, and hopefully, this is what got me interested in doing the podcast.
Do you think that there has been some sort of, let's just call it a lowest common denominator way of discussing Greek mythology, Greek history, the Greek gods and goddesses? Because one thing that struck me rereading the Iliad now is how, like, so many of the things that we might be told going back to like high school or even college, so many things that you might be told about a god or about this or that aspect of the history, it seems to really be kind of like undercut by what's going on in the Iliad. So for example, the idea of Aphrodite as the goddess of love, right? If you ask most people, oh, Aphrodite, who is she the goddess of? I'd say most people that heard that name, they'd probably say love. But to me, specifically in the Iliad and also other, other Greek texts, she seems much more like the goddess of sex and lust, right? Which is obviously very different. For example, when she has Helen fall in love with Paris, Helen, first of all, is one of my favorite characters in the text, and she's very kind of like knowing, right? She understands what's going on. And Paris is presented as this kind of like very effeminate, pretty boy who does not really have courage, doesn't have any kind of depth. And although she goes off, for instance, to have sex with him, and at one point Aphrodite whisks him away before he gets killed and drapes all these furs on him and places him into bed. And it seems as if like Helen is going to the room to have sex, like against her will, right? There's no actual love there, and she constantly uses phrases like courage and manliness. She's constantly talking about wrongful actions. Like there's basically a depth there that like that love, like if it was actual love, it would basically play out very differently. And then again and again, a sex is presented almost as a kind of a negative, right? With the exception of like in places where there's actual genuine love, or even in the case of Achilles and his lover, it's never really made explicit. But I think the idea is like for like an educated Greek, right, at the time, they probably would have assumed some sort of homosexual relationship going on. In the absence of friendship, in the absence of these other elements, lust is very destructive, and Aphrodite seems to be very much in tune with that. So like do you think that that's an accurate representation of how myths get discussed, I guess, in popular culture? Like, do you feel like they get sort of destroyed in the process of like popular culture?
Well, the thing about the Iliad is that it takes place, just a number of weeks before the war ends, and doesn't give you much history about what took place before. So you speak about Helen and Paris and how he took her away from Menelaus, from Sparta. But as a queen, as Helen, being Menelaus's queen, she was originally married to another king. Menelaus took her away, and she had a child by the other king, and Menelaus smashed the child against the rocks and took her as his own. So I don't think she was a woman who was brought up through the expression of love. I think she had a tragedy, and I think the fact that Paris, when you look at Menelaus or Agamemnon, and Agamemnon coming back home after the Trojan War with his mistress, and how his wife ended up wrapping a sheet as he was coming out of the bath and slitting his throat. I mean, when you look at those, there was no principles. There was no gods came down to them and slaughtered them for what they did. They just had freewheeling situations, and so those parts of the story that deal with the love story. When you look at Achilles and you look at Patroclus and you look at Agamemnon and Briseis, and you think about those love stories and how it's separated. And it was only because of having lost that love that Achilles actually joined the war with Agamemnon. So love plays a certain aspect in their relationships, but you don't really get down, there's not enough time of where you really explore the length of that love or that romance. What you really get is the annihilation of it. And so, that's why the Greeks, I suppose, had developed the idea of the two masks, the one of comedy and the one of tragedy. Although most Greeks these days, there always seems to be the tragedy, that's what remains more with us than the love.
And to speak to this idea of like amorality in the ancient world, one of the most striking passages, I think, in the Iliad is when Hector's wife, Andromache, confronts him about his desire to defend Troy and to kill Greeks. She essentially says something along the lines of, I know it's going to happen. You're going to get killed, and I'm going to be hauled off as a slave. And this woman and that woman will be a slave. And this man, if he's not killed, he will be a slave. And it's just sort of taken completely as, it's just matter of fact, right? This is simply what happens. On the idea of love, and like the lack of like actual true romance. And another thing that I think like modern readers would just sort of look askance at is early on when Achilles is sort of just kind of like lying in his tent, and he seems to be almost crying, and he's lovesick about the fact that Agamemnon took away his own spoils of war, which is a woman, right? We don't really
Right.
see the woman all
Right.
that much. And it's very, it's like Achilles considers the fact that her being taken away, it's an affront to his ego, it's an affront to his position, right, as a soldier and a leader among these men. And the woman is not anything more than a token of this. Granted, maybe he's not brutal towards her, but the bottom line is, right, she was essentially taken as a spoil of war. And he's just lying around his tent, and he's so lovesick, and he's so just kind of unbelievably childlike, right? Like you almost think like, is this almost a teenager? Is this a man in his early 20s? What is the basis of him being so lovesick about somebody that he barely had any, real contact with? And it just made me wonder, like, do you consider one of the innovations of the Iliad the way that, like, as an adult reader, like all the heroes, they don't really seem to me people that I would normally call heroes, right? Like Agamemnon, like we know eventually what happens with him in Aeschylus or Oresteia, right? He gets killed by Clytemnestra, right? He has all this hubris. He wants this like red carpet rolled out for him, right? He puts himself on the level with a god. He's not presented very, nicely in that way in in the Iliad. You have Achilles, who, again, like I just said, there's a very much like a childlike quality about him. In the end, he's dragging around Hector's corpse all around the city. Nobody here seems to be somebody that you could root for, which I think readers could really underappreciate how much of an innovation, arts wise that is. I mean, think about it. Like, normally you would think, oh yeah, like you're reading novels to sort of, empathize with, with a character, or you're reading something to see yourself in it, or you want to root for somebody. But I'm not rooting for anybody in the Iliad. Like even if like I feel bad for what happens to Hector, I still think, this is a totally unnecessary war that he chooses to fight because somebody refuses to let go of yet another spoil of war. Not technically a spoil of war, but by the fact that she's granted, by a goddess to Paris, right? She's a spoil in that way, right? She does not have that kind of agency that we would normally expect. So, like, what do you think about the fact that in the Iliad, there almost seems like heroes are always going to be with an asterisk at the end of the word. Like, do you agree with that assessment?
Well, that was a lot that you
Oh,
said.
sorry.
No. I mean, I was listening, and when we're telling something, it's do we tell it directly or do we tell it in a kind of, I don't know, flowery or whatever way that we take a bit of here, a bit of there. When you think about what the Trojan War was about, how it started, everybody thinks, well, it was because Paris stole Helen from Menelaus, and because Agamemnon was the king of the land, and it was his brother, that he thought it would be. I thought to myself, so why did they go to war for a woman? I mean, there were a lot of women around, wasn't it? It was, the ego must have been so enormous of these men, because these women were stolen from other kings. It wasn't like it was a love story and they fell in love. It was war booty. And, but then I read somewhere that the reason Menelaus went to war with Troy was because the Trojans were developing a steel that was far superior to the Greeks. When you look at the wars that we've been involved in, there's really another truth for the attack. It may be the oil, but there's another truth. We say, why did we go to the Middle East and attack them and not go after the people who really started the war, attacked America? Well, there was oil. So why did Agamemnon attack Troy and stayed there for that many years, 10 years? It was because they wanted something more than just war booty. They wanted the steel that they were developing, because they would then eventually find that they were inferior to another fighting force. And so they needed to get the knowledge of that. And so that's why it never changes. It's always an ulterior motive. We think it's the love story because it's more romantic and it's beautiful, but I never believed that. I thought that was, and then there was other stories that Paris ran off with Helen and they went to Egypt and lived happily ever after. But they're the romantic stories we tell because that's what an audience loves to hear. They don't want to hear that it ends there and that's it. That's the ending. So you've got to give them a good ending. So, I believe that there was more than one reason why they went to war. It was because they wanted that steel that was going to be for their swords and their weaponry that would make them far less greater warriors than the Trojans. And so therefore that's why they went. And then of course, you have the Trojan horse, which I thought was extraordinary because, out of that came watch out for Greeks bearing gifts, and it was Ulysses who was the real clever man who developed the Trojan horse. So, I thought after 10 years, they needed to get back home. And so this is what they created. But I don't think, with all the goddesses and all that, that's all part of the romantic story. It gives the audience something more to go home and think about, and other than the fact that it just was something rather ordinary.
Yeah. So this idea. This idea of Ulysses, like one thing I appreciate is the fact that, if the Iliad is all about war, like the Odyssey has this a property where there's a kind of sublimation that occurs, because even in the Iliad, right, Ulysses is always, or like he's always presented as somebody that is exceptionally smart, right, wily, right. These are the kind of terms that are often used about him, the same way that something like gray-eyed Athena, right, is often a kind of like calling card for Athena. And in the Odyssey, it's much less about war in that regard. It's much more that sublimation, right? If we have this kind of like, historical ancient amorality, how do we get beyond that? Right? And eventually we did sort of come to a conclusion. Maybe it was never formalized, but we've come to understand that as rational human beings, we have to respect one another, right? And have like a kind of like non-aggression, whenever it's appropriate, because we are rational human beings capable in the same way that others are rational human beings capable of, like the golden rule, for instance, right? And respecting us. And to your point about there being like secondary reasons or even primary reasons that we don't know about for these wars, I agree. There's probably, to the extent that the Trojan War is historical, there's probably all kinds of reasons. And especially if you think about, an amoral kind of existence, if it is all anarchic, right? This is before international law. This is before, like the world's policemen and that sort of thing. You could understand that even without something like, like the discovery of like a new kind of steel, as you said, you could still imagine people going to war over something like, an abducted wife, simply because in an anarchic system like this, if you don't have this like super credible threat of like annihilation, like if you do something against my property, right? Because we're talking about these women, right? We are essentially talking about property. If you violate my property rights and I don't respond, you might violate me in some sort of even far more consequential way. So the result is going to be 1,100 plus ships. So we could, like, that's the thing, like we could imagine, based on this amorality, all kinds of reasons, but even some of these like classical mythological reasons, there's probably some truth to them, simply because we know how human psychology is, right?
Right. But I find it interesting that the only time we really pause and feel great pain in the Iliad is when Achilles loses his lover.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is one moment that pauses because of the pain and the withdrawal that he goes through. And I thought, wow, it's not over a woman, it's over a fellow soldier, fellow friend, and it's not until we start getting into religions that all these are put into categories and man making judgments on things. I mean, we're still doing it. 2,000 years later, we're still doing it, which is extraordinary. But, the thing then that follows through with the Odyssey, because have you been to Greece?
Yeah, I have been to Greece as part of my classical studies in college. Yep.
Did you go to Mycenae?
No, I was mostly in Athens actually for about a month.
Oh, well, why wouldn't you go down to the Peloponnese and go down and see Mycenae where it all started? Because, when you go to the Lion's Gate and you enter Mycenae and you see those monolithic walls, and you wonder, it's like, how did they put those together and seamlessly without cement? It's just extraordinary the way they were able to build in those days. It just adds to the romance of the story to me, to actually be there and sit in those areas of where, I would spend days down there just sitting by the tombs and thinking about what must have happened, or finding an ancient shard, because if there are no shards anywhere, then you're looking in the wrong place, and because that's always a test of life, having been there, and those Thaulos tombs in Mycenae, and how all that added to the mythology, and they're still discovering today. But when Schliemann did it, I always think it must have been remarkable when, and that's what makes me as an amateur interested in archaeology, when a man is digging and he comes across suddenly a body, and with all these riches and these golden swords, and then a golden mask, and then lifts that mask up, and then that face suddenly that has been sitting there for all those thousands of years suddenly dissipates into dust. And although he did save one, he sprayed one with lacquer and did save one of those, and the town's villagers took it with them and gave him a hero's burial. But when you go to those places, it makes a big difference. When I went to Troy and across the Troad, and I sat at the edge of those 9 cities built over each other, when you look out there and you think this is where the Trojan War took place, and it just makes it, when you cross the Aegean and you think how short a time it was to cross from the mainland of Greece and to across the Aegean to Hizalik in Turkey, and that's where he found it. And in those days, the ocean was 3 miles in from where it is today, so it had a different kind of a landscape. But that's why I keep going back, because it just adds to the memory. And I think in many ways, when you're telling a story, the depth of the story, the interesting part of the story, is when you describe it, when you've been actually there. The audience you have to be able to bring the audience up with you on the stage. That's the responsibility of the orator. He has to take his audience and bring it up on the stage with him, so that they feel they're going through the experience at the same time as telling it. So you can talk about things, but if you're not connecting to your audience, then it doesn't mean anything, because you're really just talking to yourself.
Is there anything that you want to tell us about the podcast itself? Because one thing I appreciated was it was not, just like 4 episodes, a little over 2 hours, all on Schliemann, right? You split this up first with an introduction to Schliemann and his life, and what he was famous for and what he did when he did it. But you go into kind of like your personal travels here, and you end essentially with like a 30-minute meditation on why all of this was important. Do you have anything you would say about like why specifically that kind of structure? Did you have this kind of like more, like artistic structure in mind? Like, was that like the arts part of your mind sort of like churning when you decided to split it up in that way?
It didn't become real to me until I went to the Gennadius Library. And they brought boxes after boxes for 2 weeks and going through 60,000 documents. And then I started reading his letters, Schliemann's letters, that I had them actually in my hand, his diaries. And that's the thing that got me moving. Certainly I read 9 books on him, and explored, his palace in Athens, the house of Ilios, and then going to the cemetery and sitting there in front of his mausoleum and looking at the relief that was going right around it, watching the bust of Schliemann overlooking the Aegean, and then looking at the bronze door and thinking to myself, I wonder how he was buried there. Was he buried on top with everybody else. And then I found out from an authority that he was buried underneath the tiles. And so collecting all of that, it wasn't until I went to the library and I went through and touching the real thing and feeling the writing on the page that finally got me to understand that this man, I felt by the time I put down it in writing, that I was as if I was part of that family. And you know, it was very sad, you know, that this man ended up dying in the gutter of Naples, and with all the extraordinary things he did and how he was so highly criticized, and he was also the envy of the academies of Europe, you know, because of what he and I remember where there was one a newspaper that criticized him because that was the communication those days, was writing on newspapers or articles, but that he was the envy because he decided to tell them that when they criticized him, that when he found something, that he took his audience with him in the excitement of that discovery. And if he was right, then they would have the same revelations that he did. But if he was wrong, then they would have the same revelations in making the mistake and finding out it was of a previous period. And so that's the way he thought. It was, it's like the actor, you work in the moment. You don't, you know, you pick up everything, but then you're in the moment. The same way, in the way he interpreted his journey. And so in the end, you know, when I think about, you know, here I was, a modern man walking an ancient road and thinking that's what he did. He decided that these books were written and told as fables, but that they were real, and that you know, the whispered past that took place, that changed the history of Greece for 350 years because of the Ottomans. I mean, you imagine how history has changed stories and how we tell a story, and why we had a whispered past in Greece, because the Greeks couldn't talk or be profound about their classical culture because the Turks were annihilating them. And so those Greeks, a lot of the artisans left, and they began the Renaissance in Italy. So they took that culture that we're talking about today and that influence, and then took it to Italy. And so began, they were part of the beginnings of the Renaissance. So, you know, it moves around, a man moves around, but stories eventually that will surface have got to be reinterpreted. And sometimes people have exaggerated, but in the end, that's what we have. And it's up to us to take the truth of the matter. So that's why, for me, when I discovered something in the earth, and I got emotional about it, because in some way I brought the ancient past into the present. And that's what, to me, archaeology is.
Do you think there's anything to the idea of Schliemann as an extremely impressive con man? Because he definitely has a bit of a checkered past when it comes to maybe some of his like gold trade in America that he left under, it seems like, suspicious circumstances. He seems to have married his first wife only because he heard news that his like childhood sweetheart or somebody that he was maybe in love with as a youth was married. So then he sort of like took, somebody else, right, that was available.
The girlfriend
then
was called Minna.
Hmm?
The girlfriend in Germany was called Minna. That was
so she was a girlfriend, right? He actually had like a romantic thing with her at some point.
Yes, he promised that he would come back. He would make his discoveries, come back with a great fortune and marry her. But she didn't wait. She didn't believe. She thought it was all fantasy. And so, of course, he goes to Russia, and first he ended up in Amsterdam, and then he became a merchant, and then he was transferred by a company and sent to Russia, where he became a merchant prince and married a Katerina. And Katerina was not particularly, it wasn't a marriage of love, it was a marriage because he had money, but he married her because of prestige. It would put him not just being successfully financially, but also prestige in his image of who he was. And then he had 3 daughters, and that didn't amount to anything because they all died, and there was there were there was no one left in that family. And so when he came to the point of where he wanted to discover the truth, classical age, he wanted a girl, and she ended up being 16 years of age. He was 47, but he wanted a teacher. And in many ways, he thought of himself as Paris, and she was his Helen. And so together they did. I mean, it was a wonderful love story in many ways, because he was almost like Pygmalion. He educated her and brought up at 26. She was the first woman in front of the Antiquities in London. She spoke in front of all these men when no other woman ever spoke, and talked about her husband and the work that he contributed. That he was more than just a merchant. He was a man who brought life to the ancient heroes that we thought were just part of a fabrication of someone's mind.
Although, unlike somebody like from, Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, this was not an uneducated woman. The reason why he was interested in her was, besides the beauty or whatever else, but she was, she was actually interested in the classics, right? She was a reader. Like, I don't know what languages she knew, but it wouldn't surprise me if she, grew up in typical like upper crust 1800s fashion, where she, grew up being tutored in ancient Greek, right? Being tutored in Latin. It seems like she definitely had that passion, whereas his first wife did not. On the idea of this extremely impressive con man, do you accept the criticism that he received in terms of like damaging what he would turn out to be the probable level of Troy, just excavating very deeply? Because it doesn't seem like archaeology at the time was standardized enough where you could really maybe I'm just wrong about this, but it seems like lots of people that would do these digs 200 years ago, they would probably end up in a similar situation, right? Damaging tons of relics, damaging entire levels. And, do you think a lot of that criticism was really well founded in terms of like he didn't follow what were known to be best practices? Or do you think the criticism came about after the fact, and then during his life, the criticism was maybe along the lines of, we wish we were in his situation. We wish that we were these rich adventurers with a beautiful wife.
Down to envy.
Yeah.
Did he? I don't know. When you call him a con, I don't know any businessman these days and I've known a lot of Greek businessmen who are also, in order to get moving forward. I mean, look at our politicians.
Of course.
It's the same thing. A man doesn't really change. I mean, to get to a target that they want, they will do whatever they can to get there. Schliemann, it was the birth of archaeology, even though we had in Pompeii that excavations were already going on during. So, Schliemann did go there to learn some of the trades of how you dig and what are the best ways of doing it. But when you mentioned the fact that when he came facing Troy with 9 cities over each other and all intermingled, he was looking for a city that was burnt, but he came across 2. And the big mistake he did was he thought because Troy was the oldest story of them all, it would be on the bottom of those 9 cities. So he dug straight through, and he dismissed, and a lot of the villagers at that time would take some of those rocks and stones that would have been evidence of Troy, and took them to their villages and built things. It's like the same thing with the pyramids. They stripped the pyramids of its face and then built ancient Cairo. So in those times we don't know. So look what we're doing to our cities. We knock down our history and then we build the new. And then years from now, 300, 400 years, someone's going to say, but what happened there? Well, they demolished it. Why did we demolish our history? Because at the time that it was taking place, it was convenient and it was part of our modern world. But I think in many ways, when he eventually, he made the mistake, but it was, Troy was really around 7A of the 9 cities. So yes, he did demolish history, and I think he knew that. He knew that in the end that what he did was wrong, But he was, after years and years of thinking of going for that dig, he was in a hurry, and then you had one of his associates saying to him, "What are you doing? You're cutting right through history." He said, "Well, it's not important because Troy's at the bottom," and it wasn't. And so what he thought was Troy was of a city that was from 2500 BC. What he found, the Trojan War took place in the 13th century BC, but what he found was from 2500 BC. And so, what I found interesting is what happened to that treasure and how in the Second World War, he eventually gave it to Germany, and then the Russians came in looking for war booty because of what the Germans did in Russia and stole so much of from in Leningrad. And so they just decided that they were going to steal back from the Germans. And so they took the treasure and kept it hidden until 1994, when two curators called Akincha and Kozlov accidentally discovered the treasure in boxes. And it was war booty. And there was something like 5 million pieces that the Russians stole from Germany, that the Germans stole much from the Jews of Europe, So it's sad because who goes to Russia now? And I would have loved to have gone to see that treasure, and they were forced to exhibit it in 1994.
Yeah, I have dreams of when I'm in my 60s or 70s, maybe finally I could come back to Russia. I was actually born in the USSR, so maybe in the future there's going to be a doable. Wouldn't want to go now and get kidnapped in the process, right? As a war booty for Russia.
It's like going to Iran, isn't it? Now,
Hmm?
it's like going to Iran. I mean, you'd be silly to go there. And I was going to go to Iran.
Is it, do they play those kinds of political games with just kind of like whisking away Americans?
If you looked at 60 Minutes last night, they showed one of the Iranians who was kidnapped basically by the country and kept him in prison for 5 years because they knew he was going to be, a war booty. So he
an American that was of
American
Iranian descent. Oh, I see. Okay.
American. But he even said, no American, doesn't matter who you are, even if your history was Iranian, not to go, because if you're important, they're going to use you as and claim you, and that's how they make those exchanges. It's the same thing in Russia. We have to wait till Putin makes his transition, hopefully soon.
Yeah, although I'm not necessarily like I don't think the transition would be from Putin to somebody else. I don't think that would actually change much in terms of the nature of the regime. I think geopolitically something much vaster has to happen, maybe with China or something else where Russia is part of the Western orbit. But let's not go let's not go there just yet.
Did you enjoy the podcast?
Yeah, I enjoyed the podcast. I thought it was well done. I thought the concept, I mean, like you talked about in interviews elsewhere, things like, people don't really take time out. They really don't appreciate, these, perhaps more niche elements of life that actually have a lot of depth. Like normally when I think of something like, oh, like Greece and Rome is going to be part of like a new movie, it's going to be, some Hollywood schlock like I don't know, like Sparta or some of those like famous movies from the last 25 years or so. But you didn't take that tack, right? You sort of like took the much more sort of intellectualized, not necessarily very commercial, right? I mean, like who wants to learn about Schliemann, right? It's not like a pop cultural thing. It deserves to be, right? But you took kind of the opposite approach, which again, that's one of the reasons why I was interested in having this kind of conversation, right? Seeing that depth underneath it all, I gravitate towards that in other people.
Well, my idea was, how would I tell this story that took place in the 19th century, and how would I bring it forth to a modern audience? And I know there's not, I don't talk, because I live in a showbiz world where, I have to remind people of where I've been and what I've done. But not too many people these days will say to you, so what happened when you went overseas? What did you discover this time? That kind of interest is not there. I mean, it's more on the surface. And even my
It's much more
knowledge.
like consumerist, right? It's much more kind of like I get something superficial out of it. I get the experience, but you don't really take anything out of the experience. You just return home, and then it's as if you didn't go anywhere. You know?
Yeah, well, I could give you a long list of names that want to travel with me, men and women. And I took a dear, dear friend, Jack Betts, to Egypt. And I said, Jack, I want these a few books. I want you to read this because I can't always answer your questions. I want you to be able to discover, because it's important that you will end up knowing more than the people who live there. And so when I took him to these places, I said, one day we will go to see in Luxor, we'll go to the Karnak temple, and then you'll read on what happened and how long it took to build the temple and what it stood for. It's the greatest open museum in the world. And how many pharaohs were responsible for the way it was built. So he would study up on that, and then we would go and explore it, and he would have a much more enjoyable journey because he did his homework. He just didn't depend on some guide who's going to give you a superficial expression with 20 other people behind you and tell you this is what happened here, this is what happened there, and then you come home with information that doesn't sustain, and you kind of forget after a while. But if you've studied it beforehand and then experience it, there's an added value to it. And that's what my friend did. And then I said we would have one day off, and that day off, we could look and study up what's going to happen the next day. And that's how I would do the tour with my friends. And there's just something, and you only know it within yourself. And that's the most important thing. It's your own belief system. It's who you are in the end. What did you stand for? What's your foundation about? And, just as a simple thing, I take a group of people to see Lawrence of Arabia on the big screen. The young ones say to me, God, it's so slow. They don't they're not trained to take in the vista, the images that the director took with the cinematographer to give the interpretation of the heat, the life there. And so for me, that's why storytellers are very important, because they're the ones who are going to be standing on a platform telling people who didn't take the time to investigate what they missed out on or what is available. So, I love the way I've lived. I've loved that I've gone and spent 20 years of my life studying on Schliemann and exploring these areas, and not just going once. I went to Troy 3 times. I went to Mycenaean 5 times. I went to Egypt 14 times. So there's something about repeating the experience so that it becomes part of you. And that's what makes you an interesting human being. But, what kind of an audience do you have? So, those of us who explore and become part of that, that's what I think. You walk those lands and you become part of its history. Rather than, sitting on a couch looking at movies and then your life is boring. And I say to people, no, you're boring. Life is not boring.
The idea of sitting back and watching movies, I mean, it's only boring in the sense that if you don't, like, if you can't actually extract value from that and use it in your life. I mean, I've often said that I avoided, a lot of like relationship mistakes simply because I watched a lot of Woody Allen movies growing up. Getting some of those lessons, like seeing how he draws himself, like the Woody Allen character, right? That tramp type character. He keeps drawing himself into his own destruction, and he's making fun of it. And I used to think as a teenager, like, damn, this is how adults behave. I don't understand this. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. I agree. I don't find anything boring about that. So this has been Artifact 62 with Thaao Penghlis. And for patrons, I actually uploaded recently, patreon.com/automachination, the first 36 minutes of our film on the Minneapolis poet Bruce Ario. For many people, this will be, well, not for many people, for almost anybody watching this, it would be the first time you ever heard this name. So if you want to check that out, that is on Patreon. And I want to thank Thaao for doing this show. I want to thank him for putting together this podcast and for kind of like forcing me to essentially reread the Iliad in preparation for this. It's been about 15 years or so since I read it. So it was a very fruitful conversation, I hope, for the both of us.
Yeah, listen, you know, you don't know what you know until someone throws a question at you. And, you know, there's just, to me, it's, you know, people say longevity is about curiosity. And I keep believing that. So
Mhm.
thank you.
On that note, we will see you guys soon.